There was a canoe guide who ran trips out of Ely, Minnesota through the Boundary Waters in the early 1930s. The season ran from ice out in May to the first hard frost in October. He fed 2 paying clients 3 meals a day for 14 days on what fit in a Duluth pack and a Wanigan box. He carried flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, sugar, and bacon grease in a tin. Everything else came out of the lake or the woods. Number 24 on this list lived inside his shirt for warmth. Number 16 came back from his fire smoked and folded into a tin. Number 8 on this list kept his coffee hot through a 4-hour portage. What started as wilderness necessity became, after a generation, a quiet method, the piece no one tells you. The work began as a way to feed the day, and then we carried it home. Our kitchens kept the methods alive long after the camps closed. Much of what those guides figured out still holds up in a modern kitchen as method we use without naming. Subscribe before we count down. Here are 25 of the oddly useful tricks that came out of those camps. Number 25. Reading coal color before setting the Dutch oven down. A backwoods cook never trusted a watch and never trusted a guess. Coals were read by color. White-gray ash with a pulse of red underneath meant steady heat, the kind that would hold a biscuit at around 350 for 30 minutes without scorching the bottom. Bright orange flame meant too hot, and dull gray with no glow meant the heat was almost gone. The cook would hover a palm 6 inches above the bed and count the seconds before the heat became unbearable. 3 seconds meant a hot oven. 5 seconds meant a slow one. 7 seconds meant the bake was finished, and the residual heat would do the last 10 minutes for free. That same read still works on a charcoal grill in a backyard, and it works on a fire pit at a cabin in any state. The eye learns faster than the thermometer, and the hand learns faster than the eye. A practiced cook could call the temperature within 20 degrees without ever looking up. Number 24. Keeping the sourdough starter inside your shirt. Out on a long trail in cold weather, wild yeast went dormant. The fix was simple and slightly strange. A small lidded crock of starter rode against the chest under a wool shirt, warmed by body heat through the night and through the paddle the next day. By breakfast, it was bubbling. By supper, it had enough lift to raise a pan of biscuits or a flat round of bannock. Calvin Rutstrom wrote about the technique in his Minnesota guidebooks, and Bradford Angier described the same trick in his 1956 book, Living Off the Country. Before 1857, when Louis Pasteur first identified the role of yeast in fermentation, wild yeast was the only yeast there was. The starter only needed flour, water, and a steady temperature to thrive, and a human body at 98 degrees provided the last one for free. The method still works on a camping trip, and it still works in a cold kitchen with a slow rise. Yeast does not care where the warmth comes from, and the bread does not care which century the warmth is borrowed from. Number 23. Drying string beans on a thread above the wood stove. Before canning, before freezing, there was a needle and a length of cotton thread. Fresh green beans were strung whole through the middle, hung in a long garland above the stove or across a loft beam, and left to dry for 2 months until they rattled like seeds in a pod. Appalachian cooks called them leather britches. Some Smoky Mountain families called them shucky beans. The Cherokee had been doing it for centuries before the settlers arrived, threading whole beans onto a length of rawhide and hanging the garland over a slow, smoldering fire. When supper came in February, the dried beans went into a pot of water with a piece of salt pork and simmered for half a day. They came back to life slow and dark and a little smoky. A bushel of fresh beans reduced to a coffee tin of dried strings that fed a family for a month. A modern oven on its lowest setting does the same work overnight, and a clean, dry attic does it in 3 weeks the way the loft once did. Number 22. Counting coals 8 on top and 8 below for biscuits. A 12-inch cast iron Dutch oven needs about 25 coals to hit roughly 350 degrees. And the simplest formula a guide ever taught a green cook was 8 on the bottom and 17 on top for baking. Some cooks ran 8 and 8 for slower work, then added a few coals up top once the biscuits had set. The lid rotated a quarter turn every 10 minutes, and the oven body turned the other direction at the same interval, so the heat distribution stayed even. The math came from old chuckwagon arithmetic, and it worked the same in a Minnesota lake camp as it did on the Texas plains. The diameter of the oven times 2 gave a working total. 12 inches across, 24 coals, divided 3-to-1 between top and bottom for baking, evenly for stewing. Modern Dutch oven cooks at backyard fire pits still use the same count because the math has not changed. 8 up, 8 down, a quarter turn, 30 minutes. Number 21. Boiling coffee with an eggshell to settle the grounds. Coffee in a backwoods camp meant coarse grounds dropped straight into the pot. No filter, no paper, no strainer. After it had boiled 3 minutes and the grounds were swirling, a cook would crack one whole eggshell into the pot and stir once. The shell weighed the grounds down to the bottom and pulled the bitter edge off the brew. The albumin still clinging to the inside of the shell bound to the suspended particles and dragged them down. Some cooks used the whole egg, white and all, and called the result cowboy coffee. The chemistry was simple, even if no one in camp called it chemistry. The shell trick came north with the settlers and stayed in the backwoods long after percolators showed up in town kitchens. It still works in a percolator and in a French press that has lost its screen, and it still works in any pot of coarse coffee. The grounds settle, the bitterness softens, the pot pours clean. Number 20. Wrapping salt pork in cheesecloth and burying it in flour. Salt pork was the backwoods cook's universal currency. A side of it could season a pot of beans, grease a skillet, or carry the protein through a fortnight in the woods. The trouble was the heat. By July, the salt would start to weep, the fat would soften, and the meat would turn rancid in a week. The fix was a tight wrap of 2 layers of cheesecloth and then a full burial in the flour sack. The flour drew off the surface moisture and held the temperature steady inside the canvas. The cloth let the salt continue its work without letting the air at the surface. A piece wrapped that way kept 3 weeks in the Wanigan box without refrigeration, and a long carry through August heat did not change the math. The same idea is why cured hams are still aged buried in salt, and why charcuterie boards still rely on flour and salt as drying agents. The principle outlasted the icebox by decades. Number 19. Baking bannock in a reflector oven facing the flames. A reflector oven was a tin 3-sided box, open at the front, set close to a hot fire with the open side facing the flames. The metal walls bounced the radiant heat back onto a shelf in the middle, and a flat round of bannock dough cooked from above and below at the same time. Calvin Rutstrom described the reflector oven as the most efficient piece of cookware a canoe guide ever owned. No coals, no embers, no Dutch oven, just a fire and a sheet of bright tin folded at 3 angles. Bannock was flour, baking powder, salt, a spoon of sugar, a knob of lard, and water mixed in a tin plate. 20 minutes in front of the fire and supper had bread. The reflector folded flat for the portage and weighed under 2 pounds. A modern oven uses the same convection logic, just sealed. Number 18. Planking a trout on a cedar slab beside the fire. Planking a lake trout meant splitting the fish down the back, salting it lightly, and pinning it to a cedar plank with 2 sharpened hardwood pegs beside the fire, where it cooked for 40 minutes without ever touching a pan. The wood smoked slowly while it cooked, and the oil from the fish soaked into the cedar in a way that flavored the meat from the bottom up. Native cooks in the Pacific Northwest had been doing it for centuries before woodsmen in the Boundary Waters adopted the trick on lake shores east of the Divide. Cedar planks are now sold in stacks for backyard grills, marketed as a chef move, and they work the same way the original ones did. The fish stays moist, the skin stays whole, the smoke does the seasoning, the plank does most of the cooking. Number 17. Parching corn in a dry skillet for the pack. Parching corn turned hard field kernels into a pack-ready meal. Dried field corn alone was slow to chew and easy to break a tooth on, but parched it was different. Whole kernels went into a dry cast iron skillet over medium heat, shaken until they popped lightly and turned a pale brown and smelled like roasted bread on a hot oven shelf. The kernels softened, the starch caramelized, and the moisture left in a small cloud of steam. Parched corn kept for months in a tin, took up almost no room in a pack, and could be eaten dry or rehydrated in a pot of water with salt pork. Iroquois travelers carried it on raids and long hunts. Mountain men carried it across the Rockies. So did the fur traders coming south out of Hudson Bay through the Lakes country. A quarter cup of parched corn was a pocket meal that lasted half a day on the trail, and a modern dry skillet over medium heat still turns out the same kernels in the same 15 minutes. Number 16. Smoking fish with apple wood off the side of the coals. Trout and walleye that came in too fast to eat fresh got the slow treatment. A few green apple branches were laid on the edge of the coals, not in the fire, and the fillets were hung on a stick rack above them for 2 hours, no closer than 14 inches above the heat. The smoke flavored the fish and dried the surface enough to keep it edible for 3 or 4 days in a cool box. Apple wood ran sweeter than oak or maple and never overpowered the fish, the way hickory or mesquite would. The same wood is still sold in chips for backyard smokers today, and chefs still pay extra for it. By the way, if any of these methods feel useful, there is a small vintage lifestyle recipe guide that walks through 6 of them with measurements written out for a modern kitchen. The link sits in the description for anyone curious. Nothing fancy, just the working numbers. Number 15. Drying apple rings on a string across the loft. Fall apples that did not get pressed for cider got peeled, cored, sliced into quarter-inch rings, threaded on a long cotton string, and hung across the kitchen loft for 2 weeks. The warm rising air from the cook stove pulled the moisture out slowly, and the sugar in the fruit concentrated as the rings shrank to half their thickness. A bushel of apples reduced to a flour sack of dried rings, which kept for the whole winter in a tin on a shelf. Soaked overnight in water, they came back into pies, into stewed sauce on the side of a Sunday meat, into oatmeal at breakfast on a cold morning. A modern dehydrator does the same job now in 8 hours, and a low oven does it in 12. The chemistry of water leaving fruit has not changed. Number 14. Building the bean hole the night before the morning meal. This was the trick that separated a working camp from a campfire, and it took the guide longer to teach than any other. A hole was dug 18 inches deep and 18 inches wide in a patch of bare earth at least 4 feet from any tree root. A hardwood fire was built inside the hole and burned down for 2 hours until the bottom was a layer of red coals 6 inches deep. Soaked navy beans, a half pound of salt pork, a pour of molasses, a chopped onion, mustard, and water went into a heavy cast iron pot with a tight lid. The pot was lowered into the coals, covered with another layer of coals on top, and then buried under a foot of packed dirt. The cook walked away. 12 hours later, at breakfast or supper the next day, the pot came up out of the ground steaming, the beans dark and soft and slow cooked all the way through. Nothing scorched, nothing dried out. The earth had held the heat at a steady 250 degrees for half a day. Bean hole cooking ran through the lumber camps of Maine, the canoe routes of Minnesota, and the homesteads of the Upper Peninsula. The piece no one tells you is that the dirt does not just insulate the pot, the dirt also seals the lid. Steam cannot escape, and nothing dries out at the top. A modern slow cooker on a low setting reproduces the result, but the original method needed no electricity at all. A hole in the ground and a steady set of coals did the work. The lumber camps fed 40 men this way every supper through a Maine winter. Number 13. Wrapping eggs in newspaper inside the flour tin. Fresh eggs traveled badly. The shells cracked, the yolks broke, and a sticky mess at the bottom of a pack could ruin a whole load. Backwoods cooks wrapped each egg in a half sheet of newspaper, twisted the ends like a candy, and then nested the wrapped eggs inside the flour tin. The flour absorbed any small leak, the paper kept the shells from clicking against each other, and the tin held its shape under the pressure of the rest of the pack. 24 eggs traveled 14 days that way without losing more than 1 or 2 on a hard portage. The newspaper trick still works in a glove box on a long drive over a rough road. Cushion, absorbency, and a rigid outer container do the same work modern egg cartons do, only smaller and tighter. Number 12. Making hominy from wood ash lye water. Dried corn and water alone made nothing useful. Dried corn boiled in wood ash lye water became hominy, which became grits, which became cornbread with proper rise. The chemistry was older than the country. The Cherokee leached hardwood ash through a basket of water to make a weak lye solution, then soaked whole corn kernels in it for a full day, then rinsed them 5 times in fresh water until the hulls slipped off and the inner kernel was soft and pale yellow. The Hidatsa, the Iroquois, and the homesteaders who learned from them all used the same method. Pine ash was poisonous and never used. Hickory or oak ash was the standard. The process unlocked the niacin in the corn that the body could not absorb otherwise, and a diet of unprocessed corn alone caused pellagra wherever the lye step got skipped. Modern masa flour for tortillas comes from the same chemistry, and so do grits on a southern breakfast plate. Number 11. Layering pemmican with tallow for the long carry. Dried meat alone was tough and dry. Tallow alone was greasy and turned sour. Pounded together in layers with a handful of dried chokecherries or cranberries pressed in between, the mix kept for a year in a rawhide bag. The fat sealed the meat against air. The meat carried the protein. The berries added the small bite of vitamin that kept the gums from going. A pound of pemmican was the energy of 3 pounds of fresh meat packed into a quarter of the space. The trappers and the fur traders of the Hudson Bay routes carried it. The mountain men carried it. So did the homesteaders running supply lines through the upper Midwest. The modern energy bar runs on the same idea, and the chemistry is identical. Fat, protein, fruit, pressed dense and sealed against the air. A pound of pemmican still outperforms a pound of anything off a grocery shelf for trail food. Number 10. Soaking hardtack overnight in cold coffee. Hardtack was flour and water baked into a brick. Fresh from the oven, it was edible. 3 weeks later, it could chip a tooth on a hard bite. The fix was simple and almost obvious once a cook had thought of it. A square of hardtack went into a tin cup of cold coffee at bedtime and sat there until breakfast. By morning, the coffee had softened the cracker into something between a biscuit and a porridge, and the bitter coffee had pulled some of the salt out of the dough. Eaten with a spoonful of bacon grease and a pinch of sugar, it was a working breakfast that powered a half day of paddling or trail cutting. The trick worked because the slow cold soak rehydrated the starch without breaking it down into mush. A modern overnight oats jar runs on the same logic, and biscotti dipped in espresso on a marble counter run on it too. Number 9. Frying cornmeal mush in bacon grease the next morning. Last night's cornmeal mush, poured into a tin pan and left to set up overnight on a cold porch, became this morning's fried mush. The cold loaf turned out clean, sliced into half-inch slabs, and dropped into a skillet of hot bacon grease over the morning fire. Each slice crisped golden on the outside and stayed soft in the middle, and the crust soaked up the smoky fat the way a sponge takes water. Served with maple syrup or molasses, it stretched a half-cent of cornmeal into a full breakfast that held a paddler through a morning of open water. Backwoods cooks in the Boundary Waters and the Adirondacks both leaned on it as a portable carbohydrate. The same trick still works today in any cast iron pan with a slab of polenta sliced cold from the refrigerator. Number 8. Banking the coffee pot in ashes to keep it hot. A long portage could run 3 or 4 hours, and the coffee pot did not travel well between camps full of liquid. The solution was the same one that had kept Roman bakers' bread warm in transit 2,000 years earlier. The pot was set down on a flat rock at the trailhead, packed around its sides with hot wood ash from the morning fire, and covered with a folded canvas tarp. The ash held the heat at around 160 degrees for the length of a half-day's walk. When the cook arrived at the next camp, the coffee was still hot enough to pour and drink. The principle is the same one that still drives modern thermal cookers and haybox ovens. Insulation does the work the fire used to do. Number 7. Salt curing fresh trout in a birch bark bowl. A bowl made of birch bark, folded at the corners and laced with strips of spruce root, held a half pound of coarse salt and a fresh cleaned trout for 6 hours. The salt drew the moisture out of the flesh, firmed the meat, and set up a thin crust that resisted spoilage for the next 2 or 3 days in a cool pack. The bark gave off a faint resin that scented the fish in a way nothing else could replicate. Birch bark held water and held salt without leaking, and the same bark could carry milk a mile down a trail. The Ojibwe had used birch bark vessels for centuries before woodsmen in the canoe country learned the trick. A modern cure in a stainless bowl runs on the same chemistry. Salt pulls water. Water pulled out of a fish slows the spoilage clock. The bowl just needed to hold both for long enough. Number 6. Rubbing the skillet clean with salt instead of soap. Soap stripped the seasoning off a cast iron skillet, and a freshly seasoned pan took an hour over the fire to bring back to working surface. The Backwoods fix was coarse salt and a wadded rag. After supper, a half handful of salt went into the warm skillet, and a rag worked the salt around in tight circles, picking up the grease and the burnt bits in one motion. The salt absorbed the fat and scrubbed off the stuck residue without taking the seasoning with it. A quick wipe with a clean cloth, a thin rub of bacon fat across the surface, and the pan was ready for breakfast the next morning. Modern cast iron care still recommends the same method, and chefs still use it on their best seasoned pans. The salt does the cleaning. The seasoning stays in place. The pan keeps getting better. Number 5. Setting a sheet iron stove on 3 stones for a quick boil. A folding sheet iron stove weighed about 4 pounds and packed flat against the side of a Duluth pack. Set up on 3 flat stones at the edge of a campsite, with a small fire built in the firebox and a draft hole cut at the back, it could bring a quart of water to a rolling boil in under 7 minutes. The stones leveled the stove and let the air pass underneath for draft. The sheet iron walls reflected the heat upward against the pan, so almost no warmth was lost to the ground. No fire ring built up of granite cobbles. No scorch marks burned into bare rock. No charred earth left behind when the camp moved on the next morning. The same principle, 3 stones and a flat plate, runs every backpacking stove sold today, and the geometry has not changed since the trapper camps of the 1890s figured it out the first time. A short stove and a draft hole still cook faster than an open fire ever did. Number 4. Drying mushrooms on a wire over the stovepipe. The fall woods around a backwoods cabin yielded chanterelles, morels, hen of the woods, and chicken of the woods, all of which spoiled inside a week if left fresh in a basket. The fix was a length of fine wire strung across the kitchen above the stovepipe, with the mushrooms threaded on like beads, spaced well apart so air could pass between each cap. The rising warm air from the pipe dried them slowly in 3 days without scorching the gills. Once dry and papery, they came down off the wire into a glass jar and kept for 2 years on a shelf with no mold. Rehydrated in warm water for 20 minutes, they came back into soup or gravy with the flavor concentrated and almost meaty in the mouth. The technique runs every commercial dried mushroom operation today, just with conveyor belts instead of wire. The wire above the stove was the original drying rack, and the jars of dried porcini sold in any good grocery still owe their existence to it. Number 3. Wrapping potatoes in wet newspaper under the coals. A whole russet potato, wrapped in 3 layers of soaked newspaper and dropped into the side coals of a campfire, cooked in 45 minutes into something steakhouse cooks now charge a premium for. The wet newspaper insulated the skin from charring while the inside cooked in its own steam. The paper turned to a black crust, and the steam stayed locked against the potato. The skin came out crisp and slightly smoky from the wood ash. The flesh came out soft and dense and almost creamy. Backwoods cooks did it because aluminum foil did not exist yet, and a folded section of last week's newspaper was free at the end of the week. The same trick works now with parchment paper on a sheet pan in a hot oven. The campfire version still tastes better, and any cook who has tried both will say so without prompting. Number 2. Boiling down maple sap into syrup over a steady fire. A sugar maple tapped in March yielded clear, thin sap that ran about 2% sugar through a wooden spile into a tin bucket. To become syrup, it had to boil down to about 66% sugar, which meant 40 gallons of sap for 1 gallon of finished syrup. The work ran day and night for a full week in a sugar shack. With a long, shallow pan set over a steady wood fire, the sap skimmed of foam every 20 minutes and watched constantly so it never boiled too hard. The Algonquin and the Ojibwe had been tapping maples and boiling sap for centuries before the French traders arrived in the lake country. The reduction had to be slow enough not to scorch the sugar and steady enough to drive off the water at a working pace. Modern sugar shacks still run the same shallow pan principle, just with stainless steel instead of tin and a reverse osmosis pre-step to cut the boil time in half. Number 1. Keeping a pan of beans going for 3 days straight. The last trick on this list is the one that fed the longest. A heavy cast iron pot of beans went on the back of the wood stove on Sunday morning with salt pork, water, and a chopped onion. On Sunday night, what was not eaten stayed in the pot. On Monday morning, more water and a fresh handful of dried beans went in. On Tuesday, the same. By Wednesday, the pot held a dark, layered, slow-deepened stew that had absorbed 3 days of fire and 3 days of additions. The flavor only improved with time on the heat. Backwoods cooks, lumber camp cooks, and homesteaders all knew the same truth. A pot that never went empty fed a family for less than the cost of starting from scratch every morning. The modern slow cooker is the same machine, scaled down for a countertop. The fire just moved indoors and lost the smoke. Using toothpicks to test cake doneness without drying was a delicate method to check baking progress without damaging texture. Instead of inserting a knife or fork that might remove too much batter or leave large holes, Betty Crocker's recipes often suggested using a clean toothpick to poke the cake lightly. If it came out clean or with a few moist crumbs, the cake was done. If batter stuck to it, more time was needed. This simple tool avoided disturbing the cake's surface and ensured even cooking. It was a practical hack that home bakers swore by to avoid underbaked or overbaked results. Though easy, this test required gentle hands and attention to detail, embodying the care classic cooking demanded. Modern bakers still use toothpicks, but many forget its original intent as a precision instrument rather than a quick poke. Cornmeal mush was one of those dishes that seemed too plain to matter, yet it carried families through some of the hardest years of the 20th century. Cornmeal was cheap, easy to store, and available almost everywhere, making it a perfect staple for kitchens that had to make a little go a long way. Mothers would stir cornmeal into boiling water until it thickened into a soft porridge that could be served plain, sweetened with molasses, or salted and fried the next morning. Fried slices of cornmeal mush were especially popular because they crisped beautifully and tasted rich without costing much. Families ate it for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on what else was in the pantry. Sometimes gravy was poured on top to make it feel like a proper supper, especially when meat was absent. The dish did not need much imagination to prepare, but it carried the weight of survival by being endlessly adaptable and nourishing. It was proof that even the simplest grain could keep a family fed when there was no money for flour or bread. Bartering surplus garden produce with neighbors multiplied food variety without spending any money and strengthened community bonds that provided security beyond economics. A family with excess tomatoes could trade with neighbors growing surplus squash, both ending up with more variety than either could produce alone. These informal exchange networks operated on trust and reciprocity, with families tracking favors across seasons and years. The practice encouraged specialization, with some families focusing on crops they grew best, knowing they could trade for what they lacked. Children learned negotiation and fairness through watching these exchanges, understanding that community relationships held real economic value. Bartering extended beyond produce to include eggs, preserved goods, skills, and labor, creating resilient networks that survived when cash economies struggled. The practice meant grocery stores became supplementary rather than essential, with most food coming from gardens and neighbors. Making frosted glass jars to store leftovers was a clever way to keep food fresher longer using everyday kitchen supplies. Before airtight plastic containers became commonplace, Betty Crocker's guide suggested frosting glass jars with a layer of wax paper or parchment on the inside to create a moisture barrier. This helped prevent leftover foods from drying out or absorbing unwanted odors in the fridge. The slightly frosted surface also reduced condensation buildup, which was a major cause of early spoilage in cold storage. This method was especially popular during wartime rationing and the Depression, when stretching meals and saving leftovers was critical. Housewives took pride in preserving food quality as long as possible, and this little trick gave their meals a second life without needing special containers. Today, with plastic everywhere, this elegant and eco-friendly solution is often overlooked. Bringing it back not only saves money but also adds a nostalgic charm to food storage. Mock apple pie, also called Ritz cracker pie, was one of the most inventive tricks to come out of the Depression years when real apples were far too expensive for struggling families. Instead of fruit, crushed crackers were layered with sugar, cinnamon, and a splash of lemon juice to mimic the flavor and texture of apples. Once baked inside a pie crust, it fooled more than a few people into thinking it was the real thing. The trick was in how the crackers softened during baking, blending with the sugar and spice until they resembled stewed apples. Families cherished this recipe because it allowed them to serve what looked like a proper dessert without needing costly fruit. Children especially delighted in telling guests they were eating apple pie, only to reveal the secret later. It was part fun, part necessity, but it gave families pride in serving something clever that still tasted good. The mock apple pie proved that frugality could be playful as well as practical, and while it faded with time, the memory of turning simple crackers into a pie that looked and tasted like the real thing remains an enduring story of resourceful cooking. Making cheese from extra milk turned surplus dairy into preserved protein that stored for months and added richness to meals that plain milk couldn't provide. When cows or goats produced more than families could drink, the excess became farmers' cheese through simple heating, acid addition, and straining. The process required no special equipment beyond cheesecloth and patience, producing fresh cheese within hours of starting. This cheese crumbled over beans, melted into casseroles, spread on bread, and added protein to vegetable dishes. The whey byproduct fed pigs or chickens, meaning nothing from the milk was lost. Families who mastered cheese-making never worried about milk spoiling before it could be consumed. Some progressed to aged cheeses that stored even longer, creating variety without additional cost. The skill transformed a liability into an asset, proving again that mountain ingenuity could solve problems that money couldn't. How to soften brown sugar with a slice of bread was an old but incredibly effective method to fix hardened sugar that saved countless cooks from frustration. Brown sugar, with its natural molasses content, tends to dry out and form solid lumps when left exposed to air. Betty Crocker recommended placing a slice of fresh bread in the container with the sugar and sealing it tight for a day or two. The moisture from the bread would transfer to the sugar, restoring its soft, crumbly texture without damaging flavor. This simple kitchen hack meant no waste and no need to buy new sugar, which was particularly important during rationing periods. It was a household secret passed down through generations and featured in many mid-century cookbooks. Today, people might reach for microwaves or commercial softening products, but the bread trick remains an all-natural, cost-free solution that really works. It also teaches patience and resourcefulness in the kitchen. Egg drop soup with watered stock was an old-world trick that became common in poor American households too. The base of the soup was usually just bones or thin broth that had already been stretched as far as possible. To make it feel substantial, a beaten egg was whisked in while the pot simmered, turning into ribbons of soft protein that thickened the liquid. It was cheap, fast, and filling, 3 words that defined survival cooking. Sometimes chopped scallions or leftover greens would be added, but the egg itself was the key to making it taste like a real dish instead of just flavored water. Poor families leaned on this recipe because it delivered nourishment without demanding many ingredients. It was a small act of ingenuity that made hunger easier to bear. Canning everything possible during harvest season transformed summer abundance into year-round food security that freed families from winter grocery dependence entirely. Women worked marathon sessions over boiling water bath canners and pressure cookers, putting up tomatoes, green beans, corn, pickles, jams, and anything else the garden produced. The investment in jars and lids paid dividends for decades as containers cycled through endless seasons of filling, eating, and refilling. A well-stocked cellar held hundreds of jars representing thousands of meals that required no additional grocery spending. Families counted their preserved food like savings accounts, knowing exactly how many weeks of eating lined those shelves. Children grew up understanding the connection between summer labor and winter security in ways that store-bought food could never teach. This practice meant grocery lists stayed short even when money ran shorter. Using a cheese grater to shred cold butter for pastry dough was an old-fashioned hack for quick, flaky pie crusts. Instead of softening butter until spreadable, Betty Crocker advised grating cold butter directly into the flour, creating small, evenly distributed pieces that helped produce a tender and crumbly texture. This saved time and avoided melting the butter too much, which could ruin the delicate layers of pastry. It was especially useful in an era before stand mixers or food processors, giving home cooks an easy way to achieve professional results by hand. The grated butter mixed easily with flour, trapping air and moisture during baking to create flakiness. Though less common today with modern equipment, this technique remains a charming and effective method for those who prefer hands-on baking. It embodies the practical ingenuity Betty Crocker was famous for teaching. Dandelion green salad was the definition of making something out of nothing, because this food was plucked straight from yards, fields, and roadsides. Poor families knew that nature itself could provide when store shelves or wallets could not. Children were often sent outside with small baskets to gather bunches of the bitter greens, which were then washed carefully and dressed with a splash of vinegar or a sprinkle of salt. It was not glamorous, but it was fresh, and it came without a price tag. Many families swore by the health benefits of these wild greens because they offered vitamins that were otherwise hard to come by when diets were thin on fresh produce. The taste was sharp and earthy, but hunger made everything more welcome, and the salad filled a gap that could not be ignored. Eating what the land gave you, even if it was a weed, was a skill that kept countless households going during hard times. The foraging wild greens in spring provided free vegetables packed with vitamins that mountain families needed after long winters, surviving on stored food and preserved meats. Women and children walked fields and forest edges gathering dandelion greens, poke salad, lamb's quarters, and wild onions that grew abundantly without any cultivation or cost. These greens required knowledge to identify safely, but that knowledge passed through generations until gathering became instinctive. Properly prepared, wild greens tasted as good or better than store-bought vegetables, with deeper mineral complexity from growing in rich forest soil. Some families gathered enough to can or dry for later, extending free food into seasons when nothing grew. The practice connected people to land in ways grocery shopping never could, teaching children that food existed everywhere if you knew how to find it. Spring foraging trips became family traditions, mixing nutrition gathering with outdoor time and generational knowledge transfer. Wrapping butter in wax paper for easier spreading was a practical tip that made cold butter easier to work with before the age of microwaves. Betty Crocker taught that wrapping sticks or blocks of butter tightly in wax paper and storing them in the fridge made the butter softer and easier to slice or spread directly on bread. The wax paper prevented the butter from absorbing unwanted fridge smells and also made it easy to unwrap small amounts without messy fingers. This was an important daily convenience for home cooks, especially when refrigeration was colder and butter was firmer than today. The tip helped keep butter fresh and ready for use while avoiding waste or spoilage. In modern kitchens, butter is often softened on the counter or melted, but this classic wrapping method remains an elegant solution for maintaining butter's best texture and flavor. Stuffed cabbage rolls were a trick passed down through immigrant families that quickly became a staple for poor households across America. The idea was simple but brilliant. Use cabbage leaves as wrappers and fill them with rice, scraps of meat, onions, or whatever was on hand. Rolled up and simmered in tomato sauce, the bundles became hearty meals that filled plates without using much meat. The rice stretched the protein further, and the cabbage provided bulk, which meant one small pot could feed an entire family. Leftovers kept well and could be reheated for another day, which was always a bonus. Stuffed cabbage rolls were beloved because they looked and felt like real dinners, even when money was scarce. They reminded families that creativity in the kitchen could bring dignity to the table. Reviving stale bread with a damp towel and oven heat was a clever way to avoid waste and enjoy fresh-tasting bread longer. Rather than tossing hard or dried-out loaves, Betty Crocker recommended wrapping the bread in a slightly damp kitchen towel and placing it in a warm oven for a few minutes. The steam created would soften the crust and refresh the crumb, making the bread enjoyable again for sandwiches or toast. This simple technique was essential when bread was a precious commodity, especially during rationing and economic hardship. It gave home cooks a second chance to use leftovers without sacrificing quality or taste. The trick was easy enough for beginners and made a big difference in reducing food waste. Today, many forget this old-school method, relying on buying fresh bread instead. Bringing it back not only saves money, but also reconnects us with a time when nothing edible was wasted. Potato pancakes were one of the most common ways poor families made use of leftovers because nothing could be wasted in a household that was barely scraping by. When a pot of mashed potatoes went cold and stiff the next morning, it did not go into the trash, but instead into a frying pan. Mothers would form little patties out of the mash, dust them with a light coat of flour, and fry them in a skillet until the edges were golden and crisp. The result was something hearty enough to feel like a fresh breakfast or even a side dish at supper. Kids thought of them as a treat because the sizzling sound in the pan promised something different from the plain boiled potatoes they often saw on the table. Potato pancakes were flexible too, and could be eaten plain with a sprinkle of salt or dressed up with a dollop of gravy if the family had any to spare. They were filling without requiring new ingredients, which was always the goal. This trick of repurposing cold mashed potatoes meant the family stretched a single meal into two, and in times when every penny counted, that was survival. Saving bacon grease in a jar by the stove was more than habit. It was economic survival that turned cooking byproduct into culinary gold worth more than its weight in store-bought shortening. Every strip of bacon rendered fat that was carefully strained through cheesecloth into a dedicated container, kept at room temperature for easy access during cooking. This grease-seasoned cast-iron skillets, fried eggs, flavored beans, greased biscuit pans, and added depth to any dish that needed richness. Mountain families understood that bacon grease carried concentrated pork flavor that expensive seasonings couldn't match. A jar might last weeks, providing free cooking fat that would otherwise cost precious grocery money. The practice was so universal that children assumed every kitchen had a grease jar until they visited city relatives who threw their drippings away. That small jar represented the difference between bland poverty food and meals that tasted like abundance. Using potato water to thicken soups and stews naturally was a clever and economical way to avoid flour or cornstarch as thickening agents. When boiling potatoes, the starchy water left behind was often saved and added to soups or stews to create a velvety texture without needing extra ingredients. Betty Crocker's recipes encouraged this practice as a resourceful method during times when pantry staples were limited or expensive. The potato water provided a subtle richness and body, enhancing the mouthfeel of broths and reducing waste in the kitchen. This trick was especially important during the Depression and wartime rationing, when stretching ingredients was essential. It also allowed cooks to keep recipes simple and gluten-free before dietary restrictions became widely known. The use of potato water as a thickener brought a natural creaminess to dishes, transforming humble soups into hearty meals. Today, many have forgotten this straightforward technique, but it remains a valuable, zero-cost way to improve soups and stews with minimal effort. A boiled dinner was one of the heartiest frugal meals poor families relied on, born from the idea that you could simmer almost anything together and create a dish filling enough to last for days. The base usually included bits of inexpensive meat or even bones that were boiled slowly with potatoes, cabbage, and turnips. The long cooking time softened the vegetables and drew every bit of flavor out of the meat scraps, creating a broth that felt rich even if little protein was used. Nothing was wasted, and leftovers were often saved and reheated for the next day, with new vegetables added to stretch it further. This kind of dish was common in rural households and immigrant communities where thrift was already a way of life. It brought warmth in the winter and offered the satisfaction of a stew without the cost of a heavy roast or expensive cuts. Families valued boiled dinners not only for nourishment, but also because they fed large households with minimal effort. It was the kind of meal that could be adjusted endlessly depending on what was available, and it gave poor families the assurance that no one would leave the table hungry, no matter how little was in the pantry. Using mayonnaise in cakes for moisture without butter was a surprising ingredient swap that kept cakes tender in ration or budget-conscious homes. During times when butter was expensive or scarce, Betty Crocker revealed that mayonnaise could replace butter or oil to maintain moistness and richness in baked goods. Since mayonnaise is mostly oil and eggs, it adds moisture and binding qualities that keep cakes soft without altering the flavor. This trick was a game-changer for families struggling with limited ingredients but still wanting homemade treats. It was widely accepted because it used what was often on hand in the pantry, reducing waste and expense. The secret to success was not to overdo it, but to substitute carefully, following trusted recipes. Modern bakers who rediscover this hack can enjoy lighter, moist cakes without the saturated fat of butter. This forgotten method reminds us that everyday ingredients can have multiple clever uses. The drippings jar was a permanent fixture in poor families' kitchens, often sitting right by the stove. Anytime bacon, pork, or beef was cooked, the leftover fat was carefully poured into the jar rather than thrown away. That fat became liquid gold, used to fry potatoes, season vegetables, or spread on bread like butter. It brought depth of flavor to meals that otherwise would have tasted plain or thin. Families guarded their drippings jars fiercely because a spoonful of fat could transform scraps into something satisfying. It was also a way of honoring the idea that nothing from the animal should go to waste, not even the grease. In homes where butter was rare and expensive, drippings filled the role of fat in cooking and baking. Many children grew up associating the taste of bacon grease with comfort because it flavored so much of what they ate. For poor families, the drippings jar was less a choice and more a necessity that stretched their meals further than money alone could. Canning leftover fruit juices into jellies without pectin was a homemade preservation trick popular before commercial pectins were widely available. Home cooks would collect juices from cooked fruits like apples, berries, or grapes and boil them with sugar until the mixture naturally thickened and set into jelly form. This process relied on the natural pectin content of the fruit or slow reduction to achieve the right consistency. Betty Crocker encouraged such resourceful methods to reduce waste and extend the use of precious fruit harvests, especially during the Depression and wartime. Families could preserve seasonal flavors in jars, creating sweet spreads that lasted months without refrigeration. This hands-on method required patience and careful temperature control, making it a prized skill among home canners. Though commercial pectins simplified jelly making later on, the traditional technique held a charm and authenticity that many modern cooks now seek to revive. It represents a time when food preservation was as much art as science. Onion sandwiches sound harsh to modern ears, but during the Depression, they were an honest reflection of survival. When meat, cheese, or spreads were unavailable, families made do with what they had. Sliced raw onions were placed between buttered bread and eaten as lunch or supper. The strong bite of the onion, combined with the richness of the butter, gave just enough satisfaction to feel like a real meal. These sandwiches were not glamorous, but they were quick, cheap, and required almost nothing. They became a symbol of making the best out of bleak circumstances. For many who grew up in those years, the memory of onion sandwiches lingers as both a hardship and a badge of resilience. Soaking celery in ice water to restore crispness was a simple but ingenious fridge hack that helped vintage kitchens keep their produce fresh and crunchy longer. Celery often loses its crunch quickly, especially when stored improperly or left out too long. Betty Crocker recommended soaking the celery stalks in a bowl of ice water for about an hour before use, which would revitalize wilted celery by rehydrating the cells and firming up the texture. This was an essential trick for home cooks who relied heavily on fresh vegetables in their salads and soups, but did not have access to refrigeration as efficient as today's models. The crisp celery made every meal feel fresher and more satisfying, preventing waste in households where every bit of food mattered. This quick refresh technique was widely taught in community cookbooks and cooking classes, but over time, people forgot the simple power of ice water for produce. Rediscovering this trick can save money and add that needed snap to your dishes. Cabbage stretchers in stews were another clever trick because one head of cabbage could turn a thin pot of soup into something that looked and felt like a feast. Meat was often the most expensive part of a dish, and for poor families, it was rationed out in the smallest amounts. By chopping cabbage into hearty chunks and tossing it into the pot, the stew suddenly had volume, fiber, and bulk that gave the impression of generosity even when there was very little meat inside. The cabbage would soak up the broth and carry the flavor of the bones or scraps that had been simmering for hours. Families leaned on this method heavily in the Depression era and during wartime because it meant no one walked away hungry, even if the protein was scarce. The sweet and soft cabbage mingled with potatoes, onions, or carrots to create something simple but deeply comforting. It might not have been glamorous, but it kept bellies warm through long winters. Stretching meat this way was the difference between a family meal and a disappointing half-empty pot. Buying day-old bread from bakeries at half price or less was a weekly ritual that smart rural families never missed when trips to town allowed shopping opportunities. Bakeries and grocery stores marked down yesterday's loaves to clear shelf space, offering perfectly good bread at fractions of the original cost. Mountain wives arrived early, knowing the best selection went fast to families who understood this simple trick. The bread worked perfectly for toast, sandwiches, breadcrumbs, bread pudding, stuffing, and French toast, where freshness mattered less than price. Some families bought enough day-old bread to last the week, storing loaves in cool pantries or even freezing them when electricity reached the hollows. Children ate sandwiches made from bread that cost pennies per loaf, never tasting any difference from the expensive fresh version. This single habit could cut bread expenses by 60% or more, freeing money for protein and vegetables. Preserving herbs in oil for longer freshness was a smart pantry trick, cherished in vintage kitchens to keep garden herbs usable well beyond their natural shelf life. Instead of letting herbs wilt or dry out quickly, home cooks would finely chop fresh herbs like parsley, thyme, or rosemary and pack them tightly into clean glass jars. Then they would cover the herbs completely with olive oil or vegetable oil, sealing the jar tightly to prevent air exposure. This method created a flavorful, herb-infused oil that could be used in cooking or as a finishing touch for dishes. Not only did this technique extend the herbs' usability through winter months, but it also captured their fresh flavors in a convenient form. This old-fashioned preservation trick was especially valuable before modern freezing and refrigeration methods were widespread. It allowed families to enjoy the taste of summer herbs year-round without the cost or waste of constantly buying fresh produce. Rediscovering this method today offers a delicious way to add fresh herb flavor to everyday meals with a touch of nostalgic practicality. Apple Brown. Betty was a dessert that showed just how creative poor families could be when faced with stale bread that would otherwise be tossed aside. The dish began with layers of buttered crumbs made from the old bread, placed into a baking dish alongside sliced apples and a sprinkle of sugar. Sometimes cinnamon or nutmeg was added if the spice jar still had a little left, and molasses or honey could step in when sugar was short. Once baked, the mixture turned into something warm, sweet, and comforting that felt almost luxurious compared to the daily meals of beans and bread. Kids especially loved it because it tasted like pie but was far easier and cheaper to make. Parents loved it because it stretched ingredients they already had in the pantry. The smell of apples and sugar baking in the oven made even the smallest kitchen feel rich for a little while. Apple Brown Betty was not just about feeding a family on scraps, it was about giving them a taste of joy when times were otherwise lean. For many, the memory of this simple dessert is tied to childhood and survival, proof that comfort can be baked out of almost nothing. Making fluffy mashed potatoes by adding hot milk gradually was a classic technique to avoid gluey or heavy mashed potatoes. Betty Crocker emphasized warming the milk before mixing it slowly into cooked potatoes, which helped the starches absorb liquid evenly and created a smooth, light texture. Cold milk shocked the potatoes and caused them to seize up, resulting in a dense and sticky mash. This technique was especially important when potatoes were a staple food and needed to be prepared just right to satisfy hungry families. The gradual addition allowed for better control over consistency and avoided watery or overly stiff results. While simple, it was a mark of good home cooking skill in mid-century kitchens. Rediscovering this trick can turn ordinary mashed potatoes into a creamy delight worthy of any dinner table. Bread pudding was born out of thrift and necessity, and it was one of the sweetest tricks poor families held on to during the lean years. When loaves of bread grew stale and too hard for sandwiches, mothers refused to toss them out. Instead, they soaked the cubes in milk, added a little sugar or molasses, and baked them until the dish puffed up golden brown. If eggs were available, they went in too, but the recipe worked with whatever could be spared. Raisins, cinnamon, or even scraps of leftover jam sometimes found their way into the mix to give it more character. The result was a dessert that felt indulgent without costing anything extra. For children, it was often the only sweet treat they saw in a week, and for parents, it was proof that resourcefulness could turn waste into joy. Bread pudding tasted like comfort, and more than that, it tasted like resilience. Stretching ground meat with oatmeal was one of the oldest and most effective tricks passed down through generations of mountain families who understood that a pound of beef could become two with the right technique. Women would mix a cup of raw oatmeal into every pound of ground meat, adding an egg to bind everything together and seasonings to mask the grain. The oatmeal absorbed the meat juices during cooking, swelling into something that tasted remarkably close to pure beef while doubling the volume. This wasn't just about saving money, though a pound of oatmeal cost pennies compared to another pound of meat. The oatmeal actually improved the texture, keeping meatloaves moist and meatballs tender in ways that pure beef couldn't match. Families used this trick for everything from hamburger patties to chili to spaghetti sauce, feeding 8 mouths on what should have fed 4. The children never knew the difference, and parents smiled knowing their grocery budget stretched twice as far. Creating mock mayonnaise with egg yolk and vinegar was a wartime-era hack that helped households cope when commercial mayonnaise was scarce or rationed. This clever substitute involved whisking egg yolks with vinegar, oil, and seasonings to mimic the creamy texture and tang of real mayonnaise. Betty Crocker's cookbooks offered this recipe as an affordable and easy alternative that required only basic pantry ingredients. The mock mayo kept salads, sandwiches, and dressings flavorful during tough economic times and supply shortages. It was particularly useful when fresh eggs and vinegar were more available than processed condiments. This homemade version might not have had the exact consistency of store-bought mayo, but it delivered the essential taste and moisture needed in classic recipes. Today, recreating this old-fashioned substitute can connect modern cooks to a resourceful culinary tradition that made simple ingredients stretch farther while keeping meals delicious and familiar. Corn fritters were another staple of survival kitchens, born out of the love for cornmeal and the convenience of canned corn. Families mixed flour, baking powder, and a few spoonfuls of corn into a batter and fried it in oil or drippings until golden and crisp. The result was a cheap side dish that paired with soups, stews, or even just a glass of milk. Corn fritters filled stomachs while offering a little crunch and sweetness, which made them feel special compared to plain bread. Kids loved them because they resembled little pancakes, and parents appreciated that they required almost no ingredients. For families living on very little, corn fritters were proof that something humble could still taste delightful. Raising backyard chickens for eggs provided daily protein that cost almost nothing once the initial flock was established and self-sustaining through natural reproduction. Hens ate kitchen scraps, garden waste, insects, and minimal purchased feed while producing eggs that would cost significant money at stores. A small flock of 6 hens could provide more than enough eggs for a family, with surplus to barter with neighbors for other goods. The chickens themselves eventually became soup when egg production declined, meaning nothing was wasted in the cycle. Children gathered eggs as morning chores, learning responsibility while literally collecting breakfast. The birds required minimal space and equipment, making them accessible even for families with small properties. Backyard eggs tasted richer than store versions, with deep orange yolks that spoke to the varied diet the birds enjoyed. This single practice could eliminate one of the largest recurring grocery expenses entirely. Split pea soup with ham bone was one of the cleverest ways poor families managed to squeeze the last bit of value out of what little meat they could afford. Instead of throwing away the bone after a ham dinner, it would be saved, simmered for hours with dried split peas, onions, and carrots until the marrow and scraps of meat flavored the pot. Dried peas were cheap, filling, and available in bulk, making them an essential pantry staple. The soup was thick and hearty, providing protein and warmth when fresh meat was a luxury out of reach. For children, it might not have been glamorous, but for parents, it was a reliable way to stretch one bone into meals for several days. Leftovers often thickened overnight, turning into something that could be spread on bread or reheated into an even heartier dish. The humble split pea soup became a reminder that frugality could create comfort, and that resourcefulness often turned scraps into something beloved. Many who grew up on it carried the taste into adulthood, not as a reminder of poverty, but of the creativity that helped families survive lean times with dignity and full bellies. Because the work these tricks came from did not survive in a museum. The work survived in the doing. A reflector oven still bakes bannock the way it did in 1932. A bean hole dug 18 inches deep still feeds 12 hungry people through a cold night. A wood ash lye soak still turns dried corn into hominy on our stovetops. The methods outlasted the camps that taught them, and the kitchens that picked them up never had to call them old. They just worked. The hands that did the cooking are gone. The cooking itself is not.